Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Oral Talmud. I'm Dan Liebenton, and I'm here with B'nai Lappy. Hey, B'nai.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Good. Great to see you.
Good to see you. I was just feverishly looking through my Jastro, looking up a word that I'm
Oh,
excited about.
all right. That's very exciting piece. So let's jump right into it. So today we are looking at a text that comes from the Tractate of Sanhedrin, page 75a. And you want to set it up for us?
Sure. So it's a story. And as I think we've mentioned before, scholars and learners generally have historically divided up all the material in the Talmud into two very neat categories: halacha, law, and agadah, story or narrative. And that's kind of been, until I would say the last 40 years or so, the general understanding. And the law has been seen as like the real deal. That's the important stuff. And the narrative, the Agadah, has been seen as material for sermons and the stuff you teach women, with a giant sticky on that, the unimportant fluff. But more recently, scholars have been realizing that that's not only an artificial, but a misleading characterization. And beginning with the late Robert Cover and Scott Barry, sorry,
Barry.
Barry Wimpheimer, who we've had on our show, also develops this even further. And Barry says in Cover, they both say there's an interlocking relationship between the stories of people's real lived life experiences and law. And the stories come to problematize and undermine and subvert and make you re-question and challenge and critique the simple law. And it gives us a very complex, thick, not so clear understanding of how we should live. And Barry calls this narrative legal narrative. So it's not just story, in order to tie it back into law. Okay, so the text we have today is one of these legal narratives. It's a story that comes immediately after one of the most famous statements of new law in the Talmud, which we learned together, which is on the very page right before Sanhedrin 74a, where the rabbis, I think we're going to show that on the screen, right?
Yep.
And this is the famous scene in Nietzsche's attic. So I'll let you run us through this.
Okay, so we've studied this before, but it goes like this. Rabbi Yochanan says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak, the sages who discussed this issue, which is the issue of whether you can transgress certain laws if you're told that you're going to be killed otherwise. The sages who discussed this issue counted the votes of those assembled and concluded in the upper story of the house of Nitza in the city of Lod, or also called Nitza's attic, all transgressions that are mentioned in the Torah, if a person is told, transgress this prohibition or else I will kill you, he may transgress the prohibition and not be killed. This is the halacha concerning all prohibitions except for those of idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed.
Okay, so this is the really chutzpahdik move of the rabbis to say, okay, we've got this Torah, here's God's word, God told us to do these things and not do these other things. And we are going to say, actually, it's okay. You may violate those laws, even the prohibitions, which are the stickier ones to violate. You may do that which Torah says is forbidden in order to save your life. For example, if a no-goodnik, someone from the Malchut, the non-Jewish government, or some bad person says, violate this piece of Torah, eat this cheeseburger, build a fire on Shabbat, whatever it is, or else I'll kill you. Until this moment in history, the law was God's word is God's word. You don't violate God's word, let yourself be killed.
Mm-hmm.
And at this moment, the rabbis say, no, we don't think that is really our best guess at the kind of God we actually have or want. We think God wants us to live, and even if it requires us to violate Torah. And they say it's okay to violate Torah. It's incredibly chutzpahdik, and we all think of it as, ho hum, because we live, 2,000 years into, of course you save your life. Of course, that's what it means to be a Jew. Okay.
Right. By the way, recently, I don't remember where, but recently I heard somebody talking about the Jewish law and the Torah, and they said something like, well, and of course, anything could be violated for saving a life, as if, and like the way they talked about it was like in their mind, and I think this was an Orthodox, if I'm recalling correctly, an Orthodox rabbi, saying like as if like in that person's mind, it's like it actually says this in the Torah,
right.
Which it doesn't, but that's become so solidified.
Absolutely. Okay, so the rabbis established that law, that saving a life is of paramount importance, violate any law in the Torah with 3 exceptions to save a life. Great. The very next page, we get into the messiness of carrying out that value. And I think this speaks to the difficulty of living with multiple, sometimes conflicting values. And that happens. That's how life is. And the rabbis recognize that. And so here comes a conflicting value in this story that makes them not so sure that life is always to be preserved. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And just to remind what the
Sorry.
and just to remind what the exceptions are to that, right? That they are number 1, idolatry, number 2, forbidden sexual relations, which is a very particular set of forbidden sexual. So it's not just like anything that involves sex that's forbidden. It's a particular set of, essentially incest and adultery and that kind of thing. It's not just sort of having sex outside of marriage. That's important for this.
Which, by the way, is not forbidden.
But it's not. It's frowned upon.
It is frowned upon.
In other words, like you're not supposed to do it, even in the Torah. You're not supposed to just willy-nilly, right? I mean, like you're supposed to marry the woman if you have sex with her before you're married.
That's right. But just to be clear, when I said it's permitted if that person who you're not married to, let me say it differently. You're permitted to have sex with someone who you would be permitted to marry. Even if you're not married to that person. As long as you're not a woman. Okay. Oh gosh, I said that in such a complicated way. Let me say it. Let me try it one more time. Back in the day, in the rabbis' day, when men were allowed to have multiple wives and women were not, a married man, this is probably not necessary. Well, forget it. Let's just say single people. Here's a simple case. Single people can have sex with one another if they are also potentially permitted to marry one another. Right. That's not forbidden. The rabbis preferred them to get married because back in the day, that would have been beneficial to women because otherwise she would have been quote unquote less desirable. There's just so many stickies to put on this conversation. Right. Okay. Anyway.
We'll delete some of this from the podcast version. No. And the last one is bloodshed, which means again, specific categories. We don't have to get into it, but I just wanted to point that out because the case here is going to involve sex, and the point to understand is that it's not in the category of those forbidden sexual relations that the Torah prohibits, right?
Well, that depends. Is the sex adulterous sex? Is the sex in question in our text? That's one of the central
Okay,
questions.
okay.
Is it in the category of one of those kinds of sexual prohibitions that you should rather die than commit? Or is it one of those that normally it's okay to violate to save your life? That's going to be a question.
Okay, so let's look at the text from the Gemara now.
Okay.
So Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, there was an incident involving a certain man who set his eyes upon a certain woman and passion rose in his heart to the point that he became deathly ill.
Okay, so there's so much even in this first setup line. First of all, this is, in English, the translation is incident, but it actually has a really technical frame. And in Hebrew, that term is ma'aseh. So this is a ma'aseh. This is a precedent. Okay, so it's being named as a case that happened with a ruling on it, and we should use this as a precedent. Okay, so this is not just a story once upon a time, or I heard about the time. This was actually a legal case. Okay, that came from a story, came from an event, an incident in somebody's real life. Okay, so that's what ma'asehs are, and they're fascinating because they're real life making law messy, and that's what the rabbis are letting real life do. And as someone whose real life makes the law I was born into messy, I really appreciate this dynamic.
So, and this particular weird case, like it's sort of funny because when you were talking about, and I knew what was coming here, but when you were talking about like this whole question about like doing things that are forbidden, and you said eating a cheeseburger, you know, I was just thinking about the phrase like, I'm dying for a cheeseburger, you know, and it's like, if you're actually dying for a cheeseburger in Judaism, you can have one. In other words, like if you're going to die, if you don't have a cheeseburger, then you can have the cheeseburger. Now, the question is that ever really the situation that you're dying for a cheeseburger, or is that just a phrase, just a, you know, expression? And here the person is saying like, I'm dying to have sex with that woman. And the Talmud is taking that claim seriously, that he actually would die if he did not.
That's right. So this guy has some malady. And one of the questions is, what's the matter with this guy? Seriously.
Maybe he's an ancient man. That's the malady.
But you know, the text says he is like, he has set his eyes upon this woman, and his heart has become ill, basically. And Rashi explains this out. And that was the word I was looking up. And the explanation for what has happened to him is that his heart has become sort of, it stopped working. It stopped because it's been so overwhelmed. So there is the recognition that because of his love, and I'm going to put love in quotes here, because from the get-go, it strikes the modern reader as kind of fishy. And a person who lives in a patriarchal society and hears about a man who's going to die unless he has, you know, well, we'll see soon. He's going to die because of his feelings for this woman. We're like, really? Like, really? What? Like, what's his deal? You know?
Well, that's where, like, to me, it actually kind of raises this question: is like, is this a serious story? Like, I mean, even to that, like, in other words, like, I hear a story like this, and my initial response is like, that is ridiculous. Like, that is not a thing. You know, that, in other words, like, that is like, we have this expression, right? I would die for a cheeseburger. I give you $1 million for that cheeseburger. It's like, in none of these cases.
By the way, I've never heard of this. I would die for a cheese. Is that a thing?
Oh, not for a cheeseburger, but I mean, like, I'm dying to do something, right?
Got
Like,
it. Right. I'm dying for whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure somebody said I'm dying for a cheeseburger, but you're not just traveling in the certain set of circles. No, but I mean, like, people talk about like, I'm dying for something, or I would give you $1 million for something. Actually, a lot of times, Richard Elliott Friedman, who's a scholar of the Bible, he actually talks about how in the Bible, where it says, you know, I will give you half my kingdom for this, or I will I will give you, in the story of Abraham buying the burial plot for his wife Sarah, he says the person says, you know, take it for nothing. In other words, and Richard Elliott Friedman talks about how these are just rhetorical expressions, just like we have rhetorical expressions like I'd pay $1 million for that or I'd die for that. And they don't really mean that. And if you read them as like the person actually was saying to Abraham he was going to give it to him for free, like you're not actually understanding what the biblical author is trying to say. Just and here too, like, and I don't think this is resolvable. I don't think you and I know, but I'm just pointing it out that it strikes me a little bit like something so absurd as this notion that's explored here makes me wonder whether the case is meant seriously, that like this is really a thing that happens, or there's a tongue-in-cheek just in the setting up of this case, or there's something, maybe it's not tongue-in-cheek, maybe it's rhetoric, whatever it is, worth considering. Maybe.
And I realize that we've anticipated the next line in the text, which really spells out his condition. I personally think this is a for real thing, meaning I think this was a real case. I don't know what's the matter with this guy, but I think he felt that he was like dying of love sickness. And this story is often called the lovesick man. He is physically sick from whatever it is that he's feeling about this woman who he has set his eyes upon. He's never even met her. And in my imagination, he's gone to the rabbis and he said, and that's not in the text, but I think that this is the bracketed part that you have to assume. He's gone to the rabbi and said, what can I do? Can I don't know what to do. And then here comes the next line. Okay.
So and they came and asked doctors what was to be done with him.
Right. So that's the fact that and I think they is the rabbis. The rabbis that aren't asking the doctors what to do is because they've already been presented with the dilemma. This man has already been brought to the rabbis. And that's kind of interesting that he'd be brought to the rabbis before doctors. Maybe the initial question is, what's the right thing for him to do rather than what is his actual condition? And the rabbis are saying, you know what? It actually depends on what your real condition is. We don't know. We don't know how ill you really are and how much this love sickness is really threatening your life. So the rabbis go to doctors, and that all by itself is interesting because what it's saying is there are quote unquote extra halachic sources. In other words, there are sources outside of the Torah corpus or rabbinic corpus that are trusted as relevant to what we think God wants. And doctors are for sure trusted. So
interesting and important given everything that's going on today with the COVID vaccine, for example, or with COVID in general in the ultra-Orthodox communities, for example.
Absolutely.
There seems to be not that level of trust that apparently the Talmud has for doctors and would say that they should have.
Agreed.
So the doctor said he will have no cure until she engages with sexual intercourse with him.
Okay, so let's stop there.
I mean, okay, yeah. I just think there's a lot of bad medical information in the Talmud, and this might be one of them.
Yes, I think this is definitely bad medicine, but I think this is really their sincere and authentic diagnosis. They think he will die if he doesn't have sex with her. And the rabbis accept that. The rabbis accept the doctor's diagnosis that if he doesn't have sex with this woman, he will die. Okay, so in the reader's mind, that definitely triggers the text from the previous page. In other words, the law as has just been set up, that you do anything, you break any law, you violate any prohibition to save a life, except for idolatry. You don't commit idolatry even to save your life. Murder, you don't murder an innocent person even to save your own life or for the purpose of saving your own life. And you don't engage in that set of sexual prohibitions like incest and adultery, even to save your life. Okay, but let's note already the reader has to be saying, wait, would that be a forbidden, one of those forbidden sexual intercourses in that category of things that you should rather die for? Nothing in the story makes us think that. That's going to come up later explicitly, but so far you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? Okay, and what do the rabbis say when they have the diagnosis? They have all the information they need to know what's the matter with this guy, and they believe the doctors.
So the sages said, let him die and let her not engage in sexual intercourse with him.
Okay, so that's really notable. Given the previous page, you would have thought that they would say, yeah, bring the woman in, call her up, bring her into our office, give him a room. We have to do whatever we can to save this guy's life.
Mm-hmm.
Let him do it and he'll survive. And they say, no, let him die.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So is your read on that what they are saying by implication is that this counts as a forbidden sexual relations under the previous text, the previous statement?
I think without evidence that this woman is married,
right,
which would make sex with this lovesick man adulterous for her and therefore forbidden for him, and in the category of things you should rather die than do. I think the assumption is she is not in that category.
right. So that's what I was trying to set up earlier. I was trying to say that if this particular case, and like, just to explain what you're saying, like, if he had been married or she had been married or they were siblings or whatever the case might have been, that would have been in the description given to us.
Yes. Yes.
So the fact that it just says a man and a woman suggests that it's just any old man, any old woman. Maybe they're single, maybe somehow it's otherwise. Maybe he's married and she's, whatever. But that they're somehow permitted to each other under the law that as they have it.
I think so. And the Gemara itself is going to articulate this very conversation that you and I are having in a minute. But
Okay.
at this point, I think the assumption is they would have been permitted, because if she were married, that's what the text would have said. The text clearly would have said, no, they can't, because that's an example of what we taught on the previous page, and therefore he has to die. But they don't. Right.
So if it turns out that that's the situation, that they are permitted to each other from a kind of legalistic standpoint, again, like, I mean, I'm sure we would talk about, like, this is a terrible story in all kinds of ways, in that it puts the woman in the position of an object. It says that somehow because a man might die if he doesn't have sex, there's even a question that they should, have sex because, or do anything, that she doesn't want to do because of this man's situation. That they're not asking, are they allowed to have sex if she wants to? I mean, there's some kind of, treatment here of the woman as essentially an object, it's property, which is part of what was the condition of women at that time. And they're, right, it's terrible in all kinds of ways. Within the schema that they're setting up, though, it's not a forbidden sexual relation under the Torah law. So what the implication would be, if this is forbidden, in other words, if he's supposed to be allowed to die rather than to have sex with her, then either that sort of adds another category. So it's idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed, and this other category, whatever this is going to be, or some version of, like, it doesn't count if it's like a sickness, a heart, in other words, it's not somebody with a gun to your head, it's some kind of, but it's one or the other. It's in other words, it doesn't fall naturally into what we just read. It's the point that I'm trying to bring out.
I agree. I think the fact that the case doesn't present her as a married woman, and therefore it's an easy case, he cannot save his life by engaging in adultery. It doesn't say that. It simply says, let him die and let him not have sex with her. Not because that would be adulterous. And we just learned a minute ago that adultery is something that you can't transgress even to save your life. So you're right. What the story at this point is raising is, maybe we've got a fourth category of value, something that's so important to us that we wouldn't permit the violation of it even to save a life. And I think that's what we're getting at.
Okay, so continue.
And thank you for articulating how difficult and problematic this text is in terms of the woman who is an object who's being discussed, as to whether we should, and the actual text is even more clear. It's even more painful in the way it is articulated. That to have sexual intercourse with her is a nice outside translation. The actual text says that she be penetrated for him. It's very difficult. It's a really painful scenario, picture, understanding of women, and let's not minimize that for sure.
No, and I think that in the time ahead on this show, I think there'll be opportunities to talk about, as I've been thinking about it more and more lately, it feels to me like when you ask this question of that you talk about, like, is there been a crash? And after, the crash as opposed to a hiccup, let's say, and if there's a hiccup, it feels like, okay, so then we do some little surgery and we fix the hiccup and everything's back to normal. So if you think, for example, and by the way, like there's a way in which saying, oh, we didn't used to let women be rabbis. Now we're going to admit women to rabbinical school. We didn't used to let LGBT folks be rabbis. Now we're going to admit them to a rabbinical school. It's like, there's one way of looking at it. That was a hiccup. Oh, silly us. Why should we have been denying these people to be rabbis? Let's fix that. Now everything's okay. Let's continue to move on. But there's another possibility that fact that we're not admitting so-and-so to be a rabbi, is actually sort of wrapped up in a much deeper reality that this whole system was built on a foundation of certain things being seen to be true, that once we see that those foundational things, even if they're not foundational principles of Judaism per se, but they're foundational things about the society in which Judaism grew up, you say, well, if this is a foundational thing and the whole system is actually built on that foundation, it's like a game of Jenga, or, once we take out that piece, the whole thing would fall down. That's more of a crash. And I'm interested in this question about whether, as we think about it more, things that have to do with feminism, with direct homophobia, or transphobia, or that those things just naturally flow from feminism, but from misogyny, that if we might start to see those things as more foundational, and if so, what does that mean? And I don't think it means, we wouldn't be doing the show if we thought that it meant that you take everything and you flush it down the toilet and go do something else. There's something to be done with the material, but it's not quite just we have to do a little bit of minor or major surgery. And I'm starting to feel like the whole question of misogyny and where that leads in terms of things like homophobia and transphobia, et cetera, that those actually might represent in and of themselves, even if you didn't have anything else, which we do, like belief in God or other kind of factors that are important. But that in and of itself feels to me like it's significant enough to represent a crash that would require a complete reworking of Judaism, as opposed to just something that we can patch with some more, openness or admissions to rabbinical school.
I agree. I agree completely. And, it's funny that you mentioned, admitting queer people to rabbinical school, because this question, the entertaining the possibility that the foundation or the foundational assumptions of our system, and what it mirrors from its time and surrounding cultures about gender generally, which
Mhm.
which have implications for patriarchy, misogyny, sexuality, gender expression, that we can entertain that question is what happens
Yeah.
when you let women go to rabbinical
I was
school.
going to say the same thing. Yeah.
And when you let queer people go to rabbinical school, even if you don't let them, if you don't watch Oprah enough to know that they're there, I mean, how did they let me in? I don't know. In any
Right.
case,
No, but go ahead.
so you got to start somewhere. And even though, letting women into rabbinical school isn't the fix, it's the beginning of the end, or beginning of the beginning. It's the beginning of a new beginning,
Yeah.
which is going to have a new foundation. I mean, that's what we're doing, right?
Well, yeah, and I just want to point out, not because obviously I oppose the not letting in, but I would point out that that is a bit of a confirmation for the people who don't want to let certain people in.
Yeah, sure.
They're kind of right. I mean, like from their own perspective, like it is gonna potentially undo what they're trying to save.
I know. I always objected to the reassurance that back in the day, queer people used to give to the straight world. It's like, this isn't going to upturn your world. This isn't going to upset the apple cart. This isn't going to destroy. It is. You should be afraid.
Right.
Be very afraid. Yeah. But
right.
Of course, strategically, that wasn't the right thing to say.
No, of course, right. But it is interesting to ponder. And the other question, I mean, so then I think there's two questions, and then we should get back to the text. But I think there's two questions that kind of arise from this. One is like you said, and this is descriptively true, that the set of dominoes falling that has led us to raise this question of maybe misogyny actually undoes the whole system and is itself the reason or a reason that this is actually a crash and a new Judaism is needed as opposed to just a hiccup, that set of dominoes started falling when women were initially when women and then later when LGBTQ folks were admitted into rabbinical school. And that once you start educating people formally, they will discover things that maybe you didn't want them to discover, and they will start to raise questions that might actually ultimately undo the system. The question, though, to my mind, is also, is there an alternative direction? And I think that there is, but we're trying to, in other words, I think that part of my mission, like part of what I'm trying to do to some extent, is to make it possible for people to educate themselves without going to rabbinical school, and is there a way to do that on the fringes, on the margins without needing
that's what SPAR is about.
Yeah, right. So and led by a person who went to rabbinical, who got it right. I mean, I always tell your story like as a Prometheus story, and I think you described it. I don't think you use that language, but when you describe it to me, I say, oh, that's like Prometheus, like stealing fire from the gods,
Yeah, and I talk about it as Robin Hooding.
Yeah,
the Talmud or the
Trinity. So maybe that's like somebody's got to go in, get the knowledge, and then bring it out to the margins and make it available without having to, run that gauntlet. So in any event, there's a lot of interesting stuff here that we will return to on this show.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing and then we'll get back to our text, which is not only do these folks who, sneak in or get let in see what's really in the tradition for good and for bad, lots of bad stuff, but also, discover amazingly radical ideas like the concept of svara, but bring their life experience, the experience of people on the margins, it has so much important insights to, bring to the tradition and shake it up and make it better. So it's both those things. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So returning to the text. So I mean, this is like another part that makes me like laugh a little bit at this text. Like again, it's like a grotesque laughter, but there's something where it makes me feel like a little bit like this text isn't 100% serious, because they say he'll have no cure until she engages in sexual intercourse with him. The sages said, let him die and let her not engage in sexual intercourse with him. Then the doctor said, oh, wait, he still can't be cured. Actually, it turns out that they don't have to have sex, that let her stand naked before him.
Yeah. So, okay. So I agree. This always made me think, as soon as the doctors say, okay, he can do this and he'll survive, then maybe the rabbis were like, we're not going to listen to you anymore. But I don't know. I'm thinking of medical scenarios where, the treatment was such and such to cure the thing, but the patient couldn't undergo that for some other complication. And so the doctors take another way around. Okay, we're going to do it this way. So I think that's possible. I really think this was a case. I think this is for real. And I think at the very least that the rabbis are taking the doctors at their word at each step. Yeah. So at the second step, the doctors come back with a second opinion and say, okay, we can still save the patient.
Yeah. Well, there is, by the way, there is like a serious issue here about doctors also, and sort of, for example, racist and misogynist things happening in medicine, right? Because there's certainly a lot of evidence in medical literature that when it comes to women, when it comes to minorities, particularly Black Americans, or other countries as well, but in America, Black people, that doctors often did things that were, they did a more aggressive thing that was very damaging to the patient faster than they would have to a man or to a white person,
or dismiss the symptoms and take in a much more cavalier approach because absolutely
right. But here, saying oh, this man says he's going to die if he doesn't have sex with this woman, so he has to have sex with this woman, and then somebody tells, oh, you can't do that. Oh, well, actually, it's not. He doesn't have to have sex. I mean, it could just be naked. Well, why didn't you say she could just be naked at the beginning? When you might say, the charitable way is to say, well, they had to go to plan B because plan A wasn't allowed. So they really worked hard and they figured out, oh, maybe there's another option here. But the other possibility is that they went to they went to plan A. It was plan B would always have worked. They just never even bothered to think about it because they just think that this person is an object. So what difference does it make if they're a little harmed in the process? So, might as well, we know that having sex with her is going to work. So do that, and only when they're not allowed to do that do they kind of consider whether there's another option. And there's a lot of, right, there's a lot of sort of treatments that were, extreme treatments that were placed on women and Black people in American history, things like a hysterectomy for a woman, for something like fibroids or something which isn't necessary, but it's easier, and that was done a lot, until feminism, until women started to say, wait a second, you don't need, that's not right. And then doctors realized, oh, we don't have to actually do a hysterectomy.
I love that. I think that's great. And that's a great solution to the problem that the text has always presented to me, which is, how do we take the doctors seriously on their first diagnosis when they keep changing what will save this guy? So that I think that's a great insight. I love that.
Well, and it also gives the rabbis a little, I don't want to overstate this because I think this text is deeply problematic, but it potentially gives the rabbis, gives the Talmud, gives the tradition a little bit of a feminist positive note, in the sense that they're not, in this case, they're not exactly, or they're maybe taking the doctors at their word about this is the cure, but they're not saying you can do that. They're not willing to do that. And then it turns out that there actually is a lesser thing that you could do. And I don't know exactly how to say it, but at least there's some pushback here from the tradition, against the most extreme version of using the woman as an object here. So
yeah, I love that. I'd love to hear the thoughts of our doctor listeners, and I know we have some out there.
Yeah.
Lori, this one's for you. Okay.
Okay, so so plan B, she can stand there naked, and the sages said, let him die and let her not stand naked before him.
Right. So we're not even going to call up the woman, have her stand naked in front of him so we can save this guy's life. And that's the given. The given is he's going to die unless he looks at her naked.
Mm-hmm.
No, we're not going to do that. Let him die.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's really surprising, because if we weren't sure whether having sex with him was actually an adulterous proposition or not, which I don't think it was, but even if that was somewhat a question, having him look at her naked is clearly not in one of those three things, right, which you should not violate and rather die. Certainly, right, that seems to be something that is as awful as it is,
right,
and as demeaning and objectifying for this woman. It's not in the three exceptions. And you would think that doctors would say, we got to save this guy's life. Oh, if we can save his life by having him merely look at this woman naked, let's do it. Call her in. And they say, no, let him die.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and then the next part, so then the doctors go to plan C, which again, raises all the same questions as before, and that he can still be cured. Let her converse with him from behind a fence. So he's not even going to see her. He's just going to talk to her.
Right. So now we know we can save his life. We know he will die if he doesn't talk to her. She's behind a fence. She doesn't even have to come into the office. She doesn't, right?
Yep.
Let her stay there and just talk to him. If he hears her voice, he'll live. And if he doesn't, he'll die. That's the given. Yeah. And the rabbis say,
let him die and let her not converse with him behind a fence.
Right. We're not even, for me, already what is suggested here is we're not even going to objectify her to the point where we're going to say, listen, I know this is weird. We got to ask you a favor. We hope it's not too much of an imposition. We've got this guy and he's, fallen in love with you in such an all-encompassing way. In some way, he is actually going to die unless you talk. Could we impose upon you to just stay in your yard?
Uh-huh.
We'll put him on the other side. We had just talked. No, they're not even going to do that. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think, as misogynistic as this text is, I think this is of them pushing back on the misogyny, which I think the law until this moment would have called for them to exercise to save this guy's life. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't disagree with you. And in fact, I think we'll come back to this later, but one of my questions is whether this is one of those process keys that ultimately allows us to undo, to rework what the rabbis themselves built based on a principle that they themselves laid down, if we take this principle as being even bigger than sex, right? And we'll get there. But I think that it's both it's both like in praise of the rabbis to say that their misogyny didn't go as far as it could have, for example. And again, I don't mean their misogyny like they were horrible, terrible people, like the misogyny of their society or the patriarchy of their society. They weren't actually willing to go all the way, and they did stop at certain things, and that's praiseworthy. And it's not enough. It's possible for both of those things to be, and they didn't go far enough, and they didn't go far enough so much so that now it requires a complete reworking. But it's a better step forward even to say, and that completely reworking, they gave us the keys how to do it right here. We can get there. But I think that it's interesting to see this.
Absolutely. And on the one hand, this story didn't rewrite the earlier only three exceptions law. But as Barry Wimpheimer points out in his book, this story is attached to every halachic compilation and code where that previous statement of the law with three exceptions is recorded. So I'm not sure what to make
Right.
of that.
I would even expand the case, but I'm not ready to do it yet. So
Okay.
in other words, I think it could be much bigger than that. Okay, so let's go back.
Oh, wait a minute. Maybe that's why they don't just state a fourth category. Maybe this story is the opening up, it, like to the fourth and whatever more, whatever.
Yes. There's actually, right. That raises well, look, I mean, I'll just put it out there and then we can sort of go back to the text and talk about it. But I think there's actually two ways to potentially open this exception up even further. Actually, there's three. I mean, right. One is to say this is restricted in the category of sex, of relations between men and women, or of a sexual nature, whatever you want to call that, as opposed to forbidden sexual relations, which is a technical term. Anything that has to do with like sexy stuff, like that, we have a special case, and we're gonna have more, and we're gonna expand that, or we're gonna add that case. But to blow it up even further is to say the issue here isn't sex. The issue here is objectification. Right. The issue here, so that can take place in a sexual context, but it can also take place in other contexts. Right. So this potentially gives us the opening to say, in any case where, in other words, if you're going to be killed, or you are told that you feel you have a disease that you're going to die, and in any case where the cure would require the treating of another person as an object, that is not permitted. That's a much larger category. We could talk about what those cases might be, but you could easily imagine that things like racism will go in there, and all kinds of other categories. So and potentially we could even expand that category further to say, well, what does it really mean to treat somebody as an object? To treat, in other words, if the cost of your saving yourself is going to be borne by others, then it's not permitted. And then we could get into things like climate change, for example, destroying the earth, because that's in economics, that's called an externality. When you're putting your, when you're getting something by imposing a cost on society, that's right. So we're going to say this is actually about externalities, and you can't save yourself with externalities. And to blow it open even further is to say this is just one example of adding to the category. And this one happens to be about externalities and objectification. We can do it. We don't have to go through the whole, machinations to get to climate change. We can just say we now identify climate as something very important to protect. And so we're going to add that as a new category. So that's why I'm saying, like, this is a key that potentially unlocks the entire category. But I do think it's important to point out that once you use the key in that way, I think you could make the argument that we're still living within the rabbinic system. But in other words, because you say, well, they gave us this key, so it's traditionally radical, like your shirt said. In other words, it's not a complete rework. It's part of their system. But I don't know. Like I think it's more that it strikes me as more honest, and I think, again, not problematic in my view, to say it is a new system. It does represent the building of a new system that the rabbis wouldn't have recognized, just like Moses didn't recognize, in that story about he's in Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva. They wouldn't have recognized it. They wouldn't approve of it. They would have thought there were all kinds of things that they didn't care about or whatever. And yet, if we say that it came from them, in other words, just like it says Torah from Moses at Sinai, so we're saying, yeah, we got this from Sanhedrin 75a. Their hearts would become eased. They would be like, okay, it's reasonable to call that Judaism.
Yes. Yes to all that. I'm very excited about this new way of understanding this story, like you say, as the key, as I don't know, paradigm, whatever it is. It's the launching pad for whatever you come to realize is a value that is now so inviolable that we didn't realize should have been so important, that you want to make even more important than saving a life. This is the opening. I love that.
Which is what they did with saving a life to the Torah's rules, right? So it's actually the fact that it's part of the same text, part of the same, it's 1 page later, 2 pages later. It's it's part of that whole. So they're saying, hey, right now we're undoing a big chunk of the Torah by inserting this new value of saving a life, and we're also showing you how you can limit that in a different way that actually expands it, by using this key that we're about to give you, right? So
I love that. I love that.
Okay, so now let's go to the back into the text where here's where there's some capturing of the. Wait a second, what's actually going on here? From the rabbi's perspective,
right? So the end of the Misa itself, the story itself is over, and now there's this additional bracketed sort of sidebar conversation about that story, and probably we're going to have to continue this next week.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing, but
yeah,
okay.
Probably. Okay, so the Gemara comments, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi and Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani disagree about this issue. One of them says the woman in question was a married woman, and the other one says she was unmarried. So this is to this point. So if she's married, then it is a forbidden sexual relation, and then it's just a clear-cut case. Well, it obviously falls into this exception, so no big issue here.
Right. So the unspoken question that these two rabbis are disagreeing about is, why are the rabbis letting this guy die?
Mm-hmm.
That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them says, oh, it makes sense. I get it. They're letting him die because this woman was married, and having sex with her would have been adulterous. And therefore, this case conforms, and the psak, the decision to let him die, is consistent with the law as it was established one page ago. Sidebar to the sidebar that I'm adding, that doesn't explain why the rabbis, the position that says she was married, oh, now I get it, she was married. Okay, I'm good. Doesn't explain why the rabbis would have let him die rather than see her naked or speak with her. It only clearly addresses why the rabbis wouldn't let him have sex with her. So just want to say that.
Right, because that's not, I mean, it's obviously not appreciated, or, it's not considered something you ought to be doing, but there's nothing specifically, to that level of seeing a married woman naked. That's not what the prohibition is.
Right. And it's kind of interesting that the text doesn't point out the problematic nature of the position of the one who said she's married. Therefore, oh, I'm fine. I understand that. Misa. The assumption, I think, of the Gemara is that all of the scenarios, the speaking with her from behind a fence, seeing her naked, somehow all of them constitute adultery. Yeah. But they don't. So
yeah, and you could, by the way, see that as a key that could be used to clamp down on women by you could see a very conservative reader saying, oh, well, this means that married women shouldn't even be talking to men, and so therefore we have to keep them, very separated. See that.
Oh yeah, or now that you say that, now I realize, or it could be a positive that all those behaviors are essentially tantamount to the violation of a woman that is obvious in an adulterous relationship. So now I'm seeing that as a possibility. But okay.
Okay, so the Gemara tries to clarify the issue. Granted, according to the one who says she was a married woman, the matter is properly understood. But according to the one who says she was unmarried, what is the reason for all this opposition?
Right? If she was unmarried, how do we understand the rabbi saying, let him die, let him die, let him die?
Right.
Because none of the three things would have been a violation so awful that it constitutes the adultery that you should rather die than commit. Okay.
Right. So Rav Papa says this is due to the potential family flaw, and that there is explaining here, it's sort of like a harm to the family's reputation.
Okay. Right. So now what's happening is we're going to have two different rabbis explaining how, if the woman was in fact unmarried, we can even rationalize and justify letting this guy die. Why would you let the guy die? What's the value that's in conflict with saving a life here that's so big that we should prioritize over saving a life? And Rav Papa says, well, maybe it was this, maybe this concern about family flaw, the concern that it would bring shame to the whole family's name to know that their daughter had, been called in to have sex with, or had been even speaking from behind a fence, that would have brought shame to the family. And maybe that is a value so big that we should let someone die. Maybe that should sort of be in the list of things.
Right. And essentially, effectively, that would be adding a fourth category, right?
Right.
Idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, bloodshed, and harm to family reputation.
Right.
And Rav Acha, son of Rav Ika, says, this is so the daughters of Israel should not be promiscuous with regard to forbidden sexual relations. So
okay, so he's saying no. I don't think it's about family flaw. I think the reason the rabbis let this guy die rather than do XYZ with this unmarried permitted woman was because somehow, and I think this is not really clear, somehow permitting this woman, or calling her in, asking her to do us this favor so we could save this guy's life, somehow this contributes to the idea that this is going to make Jewish women, the daughters of Israel, be more likely to engage in unseemly sexual behavior, because we're essentially kashering this unseemly sexual behavior. We're saying, do this unseemly thing to save a life. Oh, unseemly thing, it's okay.
Yeah, like if you could do it to save a life, then maybe for other reasons
it's not so bad. Maybe it's not so bad. And
right.
But let's just put note that the misogyny under the misogyny, the misogyny under this concern that Rav Acha is, I don't know, the system here that objectifies and sort of owns women's sexual agency. It's just so thick, it's hard to even cut through.
And it's just it's one of those things where, again, like I think that there are a lot of, look, I mean, this comes up in America all the time, that right, there's wonderful principles laid down in the Constitution by people who own slaves. Once we reckon with the fact that they own slaves, does that mean that their principles about freedom of religion are called into question? Well, we should question them, because like maybe there's a way in which they're connected to slavery in a bad way. We should call them into question. But at the end of the day, if we find that they actually turn out to be solid on their own, that doesn't, so that means that we now have the mixed bag of a system that has a lot of good in it, that has all these kind of foundational flaws. And the question becomes, how can the flaws be excised like a cancer, and the system kind of still can remain? Or does the system have to be completely rebuilt because it actually can't be disconnected from those foundational flaws, or something in between, where you have a kind of a reconstruction, a moment like a civil rights movement kind of moment, which, like, again, because its success was only limited, it might suggest that doesn't really work, and you have to remake the whole, but these are reasonable questions that come up, not only in Judaism, and yet even those who say that we want to completely remake the system, right, in America, I'm just giving that as an example, like, are often not saying, and we are starting from scratch, like it's going to be as if the last 300 years didn't happen. It's like, no, there really is a lot of good things here. We do like the idea of freedom of the press and freedom of religion, whatever. So we're going to keep all that stuff. We're just going to rebuild. We just have to rebuild the system in all kinds of ways, so that, it's the things that were so bad, that continue to be so bad, aren't going to happen. Those are not just limited to Judaism.
Absolutely. And I think we have to hold both at the same time. We have to hold in understanding, for example, that America is built on a foundation of racism. Systemic racism exists, and we can't maybe fix it all. We can't tear the whole thing apart all at once.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's the painful and difficult part, because you want, oh, this whole foundation is bad. Let's rip out the foundation. Well, you don't want to be saying, let's go slow, but let's not forget at any moment that the foundation is rotted, and let's have one hand reminding and keeping that in mind while we're fixing pieces of it. Don't they do that actually with buildings?
Yeah, I think
right?
so. I mean,
they
must,
replace like parts. I don't know. There's some metaphor here. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure there's some metaphor of how to replace piece by piece a foundation that is bad without the whole thing collapsing.
Well, there is, and I know we're going to take a pause in a second, but I have been playing around with this other metaphor, which I think I haven't figured out how you do it with a country. Like with America, I'm not sure what you do. With Judaism, I can see it a little bit better, where you imagine a building that's built on a rotten foundation. You could, and maybe even think about, remember when we did the text about the leprosy is in the building, like is in the, like, so somehow it's not just a rotten foundation, right? Like the foundation is kind of, there's something that's kind of like making more of the building rotten than just the foundation, but so one thing that you could do is you could kind of try to take out the rotten bricks and the rotten foundation and like hold up the building with like you're talking about with some kind of crane while you're replacing the foundation. Like, we're not architects, but the other possibility is that you go over and, next door to it, you lay a new foundation, and then you take the bricks from the old building that are still good and you bring them over and you build the new building out of the old bricks or something like that. And you don't take the rotten bricks, and maybe it's true that there are some rotten bricks that are interconnected with good bricks. And so you kind of have to leave something behind that you regret leaving behind because it actually was a very beautiful brick. So then you're going to have to build a new brick, but maybe it's going to be inspired by that one. And maybe since it's more modern architectural methods, it's going to actually turn out to be more solid or more beautiful or whatever. So there's some story like that I think potentially works here.
I love that. And I've seen that happen.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, they do that when there's a community center that they want to tear down, but they want kids to still be able to go ice skating and whatever. They build this, they leave it while they're building the new one on next to. Yes, I love that.
Well, and just to complete the thought, like I think that the reason I can see it in Judaism more easily is because I kind of feel like you don't actually have to take down the old building. You can just say, because in other words, like it's sort of like a digital good, like that when you have digital like this, right? There's a zero marginal cost to distribution, right? If a million people watch the Oral Talmud versus 1,000, it doesn't cost us any more. It's just the same digital. So that's how it is with like Judaism. It's like we can, each of us has our own Jewish building. And so you and I can decide to go over here and rebuild our building. That doesn't really affect, sometimes they think it does, but that doesn't really affect somebody who wants to live a more, old school lifestyle. Like we just won't be together, and we might regret that. They might regret that. But for a time, we're going to be separate and we do our own little thing in a separate place, and then maybe one day what we've built is so awesome that those people come over, that's what I imagine happening. How do you do that with a country? I'm not really sure. That's like, how do you build a kind of new America, at the margins, like how do you do that? There. So that's the piece where I actually feel more optimistic about our ability to do that with Judaism. So maybe we should end on a note of optimism.
Well, I'm very excited about this.
Okay, well, maybe it'll be our next article. All right, so we will pick this text up back next week.
Great.
All right, see you then.
Right. Thanks, Dan.
Bye.